My son Steve begged me for $150,000, his voice trembling, swearing it was a matter of life and death. Later I discovered the life he was willing to sacrifice was mine. He had hired people to chase me down in the dark, hoping this old heart would finally give out. But he forgot. This heart was built to endure, and it knows how to deliver a final judgment, one that cannot be broken. Have you ever looked at your own child and seen a complete stranger? A person you know you raised, you bathed, you taught to ride a bike, but whose face has become a mask you just can't recognize anymore. Welcome back to our True Stories audio series. If you're listening with us, go ahead and give us a like and maybe drop a comment to let us know what city you're in tonight. It's a good feeling, knowing we're all sharing this together. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those dreary days in late fall when the rain doesn't seem to have a beginning or an end. I was settled into my old lazy boy recliner, the one that knows the shape of my bones better than I do. The house was quiet, filled only with the smell of fresh coffee and the steady drumming of rain on the porch roof. That sound, that was the soundtrack to the peace I'd worked my whole life to earn. For 50 years, through sawdust-filled days and long nights worrying over bills, this quiet moment was the goal. A warm cup, a comfortable chair, and the sound of the rain. Then, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a friendly ring. It was a frantic, desperate leaning on the button, an alarm that shattered the calm to pieces. I didn't have to wonder who it was. I knew. Only Steve comes without calling. And only Steve brings his own storm with him. I set my mug down on the coaster my granddaughter made for me years ago. The porcelain made a soft click against the wood. I took a deep breath, the kind you take before you lift something heavy, and pushed myself out of the chair. My knees complained, as they always do. As I walked to the door, I could feel the warmth of the living room at my back and the chill seeping in from the entryway ahead. My hand closed around the old brass doorknob, and the cold of the metal felt like it went straight into my bones. A premonition. A final moment of peace before opening the door to chaos. The second I turned the latch, he practically fell inside, bringing a gust of wind and wet leaves with him. Steve. My son. He was a whirlwind of frantic energy. His clothes, a thin jacket and jeans, were soaked through and wrinkled, clinging to his thin frame. His hair was matted to his forehead with rain. And the smell, it hit me right away. Stale cigarette smoke, damp wool, and something else underneath it all. The sour, metallic scent of pure panic. His eyes darted around the living room, never landing on me. It was the strangest thing. He wasn't looking at his father. He was scanning the room, as if looking for an escape route, or worse, looking for things to value. He looked like a cornered animal, all sharp angles and twitchy movements. I'd seen this look more times than I could count over the last 20 years. It was the look of a man at the end of a long chain of bad decisions. And every single time, that chain led him right back here, to this house. As if my home wasn't a home at all, but just a bottomless ATM. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how I was. He was breathing hard, the words spilling out of him in a desperate, jumbled mess about some guys, about a debt that had come due, the last one, he swore. It was always the last one. He was painting a picture of a man who was a victim, a man who just needed one more chance to finally get it right. I stood there by the door, listening to the familiar story, my heart feeling like a heavy, cold stone in my chest. And then he said the number. $150,000. The words just hung there in the air between us. They felt obscene in the quiet of my home. The sum was so ludicrous, so impossibly large, it didn't even sound real. "It's life or death, Dad," he said, his voice cracking, finally looking at me. But his eyes were still searching, calculating. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I tried my best to find the little boy I used to teach how to throw a baseball in the backyard. The kid with the scraped knees and the smile that was missing a front tooth. I tried to see him, but he was gone. All I saw was a hollowed-out man, a stranger. All I saw was a deep, dark hole of greed that I knew with absolute certainty could never be filled. In that long, silent moment, 20 years of my life flashed before my eyes. A highlight reel of heartbreak. The maxed-out credit cards I'd paid off. The business loans for ideas that vanished into thin air. The endless stream of promises that dissolved like sugar in the rain. For 20 years I had enabled him. I had written the checks, I had made the calls, I had cleaned up the messes. Each time I told myself I was helping. I was giving him a safety net. I was being a good father. But standing there, looking at the desperate stranger in my living room, I finally understood the truth. I wasn't saving him. I was destroying him. I was the one making sure he never had to hit rock bottom, that he never had to learn. I realized that the limit of a father's love isn't about endless giving. It's about having the strength to know when to finally, mercifully, say no. The silence in the room was thick enough to choke on. The only sounds were the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the steady drumming of the rain. Steve was staring at me, his expression shifting from pleading to impatient, to expectant. He was used to the routine. He was waiting for the heavy sigh, the lecture, and then the reluctant walk to my desk to get the checkbook. But not this time. I met his gaze, holding it steady. And for the first time in his adult life, I said the word. It was quiet. It wasn't angry. It was just a simple two-letter word that carried the weight of 2 decades. No. The word landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. It was calm, firm, and final. It wasn't a negotiation. It was the slam of a steel door. I watched his face. For a second, there was just confusion. Then came the shock, the disbelief. His mouth opened, slightly as if to say, "Did you just say what I think you said?" And then that disbelief curdled into something ugly. A flash of furious, indignant anger. He couldn't comprehend it. In his world, I didn't have the right to say no. I was a resource, a function, and I had just malfunctioned. He took a step toward me, his hands slowly clenching into fists at his sides. The panic in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold fire. And I knew. The storm he had brought in with him was nothing. The real storm had just begun. My quiet peace was officially over. When my quiet refusal hung in the air, unmoved, Steve shifted tactics. The desperate, cornered animal vanished, and in its place he summoned the ghost of a broken child. It was a performance I knew all too well. He collapsed to his knees on the rug beside my chair, a gesture so theatrical it was almost comical, folding himself into a picture of helplessness. The words, when they came, were choked with a practiced sorrow. He spoke of a world that was against him, of bad luck that followed him like a shadow. Then he turned the weapon on me. He started to talk about the past, about the long hours I spent at the workshop when he was a boy, the business trips that took me away for weeks at a time. He was painting me as the absent father, skillfully suggesting that the seeds of his failure today were planted in the soil of my ambition years ago. He needed me to believe my providing for him was a form of neglect. It was a well-rehearsed script, and I'll admit, a small, familiar sting of guilt pricked at my heart. It's a tender spot on any father, that constant, nagging question. Was I there enough? But the years had taught me the difference between a real wound and a phantom pain. I looked down at him and said, my voice quiet but firm, "Responsibility, son. It isn't a debt someone else can pay for you." The effect was instantaneous. The curtain fell on his little play. The manufactured tears seemed to dry on command, and the sorrowful mask on his face hardened into one of cold, ugly contempt. He rose from the floor, not like a broken man, but like a predator that had just been denied its meal. "You always were a selfish bastard," he spat, the words sharp and venomous. "It was always about the business, wasn't it? The money. You never really gave a damn about me." Each accusation was a carefully aimed dart, targeted at the fears I'd carried in silence for decades. He was trying to poison my memory of my own life, to reframe my sacrifice as selfishness. In that moment, with the hatred burning in his eyes, I saw his true goal with chilling clarity. He didn't just want the money, he wanted to leave me with nothing, to hollow out my soul until I doubted every good thing I'd ever tried to do. He wanted to destroy my self-respect. When that failed, when his words found no purchase, the rage he'd been holding in check finally erupted. A sharp, explosive crack, like a rifle shot, echoed through the quiet house. My eyes flew to the dining room. He had slammed his fist down onto the solid oak table, the one Martha and I had found in a little shop in Lancaster County, the one she had loved so much. A long, splintering fracture scarred the polished surface she had cared for so meticulously. He stood there, panting, cradling his hand, his knuckles red and already swelling. He glared at me across the room. "You're going to regret this, old man," he snarled. For the first time in the sanctuary of my own home, a genuine chill of fear touched me. The line had been crossed. This was no longer just about words. He stumbled away from the table, lurching toward the fireplace where our most precious memories resided. His hand shot out, grabbing the heavy silver frame from the center of the mantelpiece. It was the photo from our vacation to Chicago, a lifetime ago. Martha is in it, her head thrown back in a glorious laugh. A 10-year-old Steve sits on my shoulders, his grin wide and missing a tooth. He held the picture up, his eyes locking with mine over the top of the frame. There was a cold, deliberate challenge in his gaze. And then he just opened his hand. The frame dropped. It hit the hardwood floor not with a thud, but with a sharp, violent shatter of glass that seemed to pierce the air. The sound was devastating. A spiderweb of cracks instantly fractured the image, cutting across Martha's joyful smile, across my own face, across the innocent boy on my shoulders. He had, with one simple, hateful act, broken us all. He turned and left without another word. The front door slammed behind him, the sound rattling the frame of the house itself. I was left alone in the ringing silence, the evidence of his storm laid bare. After a moment that felt like an hour, I slowly walked over and knelt down. My knees cracked in protest. I began to carefully pick up the larger shards of glass, my hands moving with a strange, detached precision. And that's when I felt it. A quick, sharp pain in my index finger. I pulled my hand back and looked. A small, razor-thin sliver of glass had sliced the skin. A single dark red drop of blood welled up, trembled for a moment, and fell onto the wooden floor. It was a tiny wound. Insignificant. But seeing it there, on the floor of my home, felt monumental. After all the years, all the heartache, his violence had finally drawn blood. I stared at that small, red mark, and I knew that something inside me, something deep and foundational, had just broken too. I didn't even try to sleep that night. I just sat in my chair in the darkness, the house silent around me. I stared at the dark wound on Martha's table and the empty space on the mantel. The rage was gone, burned away, leaving behind only the cold ashes of a profound and terrible sadness. And in that sadness, I found a moment of absolute, painful clarity. The boy I had raised, the child whose laughter filled these rooms, was gone. He was a ghost, a memory. The person who had stood here tonight was a stranger, a dangerous stranger wearing my son's face. I could no longer afford the fiction that he might one day come back. My job now was not to save him. It was to save myself. It was to protect this house and the memory of the woman I loved. Giving in was no longer a choice. Survival was the only option left. In the heavy silence of the house, I sat with the broken silver frame in my hands. The mangled metal felt cold against my skin. I worked my thumbnail under the edge of the cardboard backing and carefully slid the photograph out, freeing it from the wreckage. I gently smoothed out the crease that now ran across the top corner. The picture was taken on a hot summer day back in '95. We'd driven the old Ford wagon all the way to Chicago for a weekend. It was Martha's idea. She'd always wanted a family picture at Navy Pier, with the lake and the Ferris wheel in the background. I can still feel it, clear as day, the surprising weight of my 10-year-old son, Steve, perched on my shoulders. I remember his small, trusting hands tangled in my hair, holding on tight as I bounced him up and down to make him laugh. His smile in that picture, it was genuine, a burst of pure, uncomplicated joy. Looking at that smiling face now, a single, heavy question settled in my heart. Where did that boy go? That photograph used to be a source of comfort for me, a happy port in any storm. Now, it just felt like evidence in a long, sad trial. Evidence of everything that had been lost. My mind drifted back through the years, through the decades of work. I thought of all the times I'd stayed late at the shop, long after my crew had gone home, my body aching with a fatigue that went bone deep. I thought of the extra projects I took on, the weekend jobs, the business trips to places I had no desire to see. And for what? It was all for him. Every splinter, every drop of sweat, every sleepless night was an investment in his future. It was all so he could have a better start than I did, so he could go to a good college, so he wouldn't have to know the gnawing anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck. I missed Little League games for that. I missed parent-teacher nights. And I always told myself it was a necessary sacrifice, a trade-off a father makes. I wasn't just building a business, I was building a foundation for his life. A small empire, not for me, but for him. And now, here we were. He was standing in the ruins of his own life, pointing a finger at the foundation I built and blaming its strength for his own weakness. He was using my sacrifice as his excuse. My gaze drifted up from the photo in my hand to the portrait of Martha hanging over the fireplace. Her smile in that painting was always a comfort, but tonight it felt like a silent judgment. I thought of her last days, of the promise she'd made me swear to her. Her voice had been a fragile whisper, thin as thread. "Take care of our boy, Louis," she had said, her hand cool in mine. Then she paused and added, "But don't let him destroy you." At the time, I didn't truly understand the weight of those last few words. I thought she was just worried about my health, that I would work myself into an early grave trying to provide for him after she was gone. But now, sitting in the wreckage he'd created, I finally understood. Of course I did. Martha always saw people for who they really were. She had seen the bottomless, desperate hole inside our son long before I was willing to admit it was there. Her promise wasn't a command to give endlessly. It was a warning. It was permission, given from the person I loved most in the world, to protect myself from his toxicity. I looked back down at the shattered frame. The act of breaking it. It wasn't a moment of spontaneous, blind rage. I saw that clearly now. It was a calculated act of cruelty. Steve knew exactly what that photograph meant to me. He knew it was one of my most treasured connections to his mother. He wasn't just lashing out at me, he was targeting her memory. He was trying to smash the very foundation of our family. It was a desperate, vicious attempt to destroy the past to excuse his own miserable present. And that realization was a cold, clarifying relief. This wasn't just ingratitude, this was a profound and deliberate act of malice. In that moment, any last, lingering ember of guilt I felt for telling him no was finally extinguished. With slow, deliberate movements, I took the creased photograph and slid it back into the empty silver frame. I didn't try to hide the damage. The spiderweb of cracks in the image itself remained, a permanent scar. I stood up, walked to the fireplace, and placed the frame right back in its spot on the mantel. I wasn't putting it there to try and forget. I was putting it there so I would always remember. Every time I looked at it, I would remember this afternoon. I would remember the feel of his violence in the air, the sound of glass shattering, and the painful clarity that followed. There would be no second chances. There would be no going back. That door was closed for good, and Steve himself was the one who had bolted it shut and thrown away the key. I would keep my promise to Martha, the real one. I would take care of myself. You know, that photograph was more than just a keepsake to me. It was a piece of our family's soul. Do you have an object like that in your house? Something that holds a special meaning? An item that you only have to look at for a whole story to come rushing back? If you do, I'd love for you to share what it is in the comments below. It's good to hear those kinds of stories. The next morning, the house was unnervingly quiet. I was in the dining room with a bottle of wood glue and a set of clamps, trying my best to mend the ugly wound in Martha's oak table. It was a slow, patient task. A small act of repair in a home that felt broken in much bigger ways. As I was carefully wiping away the excess glue, the phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the silence. I glanced at the caller ID. It was Steve. My first instinct was to ignore it, to just let it ring until it gave up. The thought of hearing his voice again made my stomach tighten. But something else, a deeper need to know what came next, made me put the rag down and pick up the phone. The voice that greeted me was so utterly different from the one that had spat venom at me less than 24 hours earlier that it was disorienting. The snarl of the cornered animal was gone. In its place was the soft, humble tone of a repentant child. He told me he'd been up all night thinking. He said he'd finally hit rock bottom, and that in the darkness of it all, he realized that I'd been right about everything. He apologized for the things he'd said, for the things he'd done. The apology was flawless, almost poetic in its sincerity. And then, after the performance of remorse, came the invitation. "I was wondering," he said, his voice laced with a fragile hope, "if you'd let me and Violet make you dinner tonight. She's making those BBQ ribs you like." Every rational part of my mind, the part that had seen the cold calculation in his eyes as he dropped that photograph, was screaming. It was a trap. The transformation was too sudden, too complete. It was a performance, another tactic in a long and exhausting war. But the heart of a father is a stubborn, foolish thing. It's built to hope. It's wired to search for any sliver of light in the deepest darkness. A small, treacherous voice in the back of my mind whispered, "What if? What if the shock of being cut off had actually worked? What if this was the moment of clarity he so desperately needed?" I knew it was a long shot. I knew it was probably a fool's hope. But the cold clarity of the previous night hadn't faded, and it was that clarity that guided my decision. I heard myself agreeing to go, but the reason was not the one he thought. I wasn't coming because I believed his apology. I was coming because I needed to understand the new strategy. I needed to see the game board and figure out what piece he was going to move next. To prepare myself, I walked out the back door and went to my small workshop, the little shed I'd built with my own hands 30 years ago. The moment I slid the heavy wooden door open, the familiar smell of pine sawdust and machine oil filled my lungs, and I felt the tension in my shoulders ease just a fraction. This was my world, a place of order, of logic, where every tool had its place and every action had a clear and predictable result. It was my sanctuary from the chaos. I didn't start a project. I didn't even turn on the lights. I walked over to the old wooden cabinet on the far wall and opened it. Inside, nestled in a worn leather roll, was my father's set of wood chisels. He was a carpenter, too. A quiet man who didn't say much, but who could create beautiful, sturdy things with his hands. I took the roll to my workbench, unwrapped it, and took out a clean rag and a can of mineral oil. Then, one by one, I began to clean the tools. My hands moved with a slow, steady rhythm that I'd known my whole life. Wiping the fine layer of dust from the steel, rubbing the oil into the smooth wooden handles. I was polishing away years of neglect. But the work wasn't for the tools. It was for me. With each pass of the cloth, I could feel my own mind clearing. The simple, tangible task of restoring order to these objects was restoring order to my thoughts. The swirling, chaotic emotions of the last day, the anger, the deep, aching sorrow, began to recede. In their place, a cold, quiet calm settled over me. I was no longer a wounded father lost in a storm of grief. I was a man, a craftsman, and I was facing a problem, and any problem can be solved, or at least understood, with the right information and the right preparation. I finished with the last chisel, its steel edge gleaming in the dim light. I placed it back into its slot in the leather roll. The crisp click of the steel against the other tools was a sound of finality. It was an unspoken declaration. I would go to that dinner. But I would not be going with the hopeful, vulnerable heart of a father. I would be going with the watchful, patient eyes of a man searching for the truth. I would observe. I would listen. I would not be caught by surprise again. I would not let my love for the son I once had cloud my judgment about the man who stood before me now. I had paid for that mistake for 20 years. It was a debt I was done paying. That little workshop has always been my sanctuary. No matter what kind of storm is raging outside, once I step through that door, I can always find my balance again. Do you have a place like that? A garage? A garden? Maybe just a favorite chair in a quiet corner where you can go to sort through your thoughts? Let me know in the comments. I'd like to hear about it. There was always a certain kind of suffocation in Steve and Violet's house. It was the tense, heavy silence that settles in rooms filled with expensive things bought with borrowed money. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath, aware of the fragile foundation underneath the polished floors and granite countertops. That night, the feeling was 100 times worse. The air was thick with unspoken things. Steve played the part of the gracious host with an unnerving enthusiasm. He kept my wine glass full, laughed a little too loudly at his own jokes, and steered the conversation toward a carefully curated list of harmless memories. He was a whirlwind of false warmth, a man desperately trying to pretend that the ugly, violent scene in my living room had never happened. But his wife, Violet, she was a terrible actress. Her smile was a quick, tight stretch of the lips that never came close to her eyes. Her movements were jerky and uncertain, When she placed the plate of ribs in front of me, her hand was trembling so much that a fork slipped from the edge of the plate, clattering against the hardwood floor. The sound was sharp and loud in the tense quiet, making both of us jump. She mumbled an apology, her face flushed with embarrassment as she hurried to retrieve it. I just nodded, my eyes following her, my internal alarm bells beginning to ring, softly at first, then with more urgency. Steve, meanwhile, never stopped talking. He was filling every pocket of silence with noise, a flood of nostalgia designed to sweep me off my feet. He brought up the time we went fishing on Lake Michigan, how I'd taught him to bait a hook. He reminded me of the summer I'd spent teaching him how to change the oil and spark plugs in his first car, a beat-up Chevy Nova. Each story was a sugar-coated arrow aimed at the soft spots of a father's heart, a calculated reminder of the bond we once shared. He needed me to remember the man who raised him, not the man who had threatened him. But I was listening for the words he never said. Amidst all the talk of the past, there was no mention of the present. Not a single word about responsibility. Not a whisper about a plan or a job or the future. And most of all, the number that hung in the air between us like a ghost, $150,000, was never, ever spoken. It was an elaborate, empty performance. I turned my attention to Violet. She was the weak link in this charade. I could feel it. She barely touched her food, just pushed the potato salad around on her plate with her fork. Whenever Steve would launch into another cheerful memory, she would produce that same tight, forced smile. But her eyes told a different story. They were wide with a kind of contained panic. I watched her gaze dart from Steve to me, and then down to her phone, which she kept face down on the table beside her plate. She looked like a hostage in her own home, a reluctant participant in a conspiracy she wanted no part of. Her terrified eyes told me more of the truth than all of Steve's charming lies combined. Then I saw it, a faint glow from underneath her cupped hand on the table, her phone's screen lighting up, then again, a few moments later, and again. I watched, pretending to be absorbed in Steve's story about a high school football game. I counted. 7 times, the screen lit up with a new message. Who sends 7 texts during a tense family dinner? Steve must have noticed it too. I saw his eyes flick toward her just for a second, and the look he gave her was as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. It was a warning. Violet flinched as if she'd been struck, her hand immediately snatching the phone and shoving it into the purse at her feet. That single, silent exchange confirmed it. This wasn't just a dinner, it was a staging ground, and she was communicating with someone outside this room. The tension finally snapped a few minutes later. In a brief lull, while Steve was cutting more meat, Violet suddenly turned to me, her eyes wide and pleading. She leaned forward slightly and asked a question that had absolutely nothing to do with anything we had been talking about. "Uncle Lewis," she said, her voice low and rushed, "what would you do if a friend you cared about was in real, actual danger?" The question just hung there in the suffocating air. The word friend was a flimsy disguise. Steve's head whipped around, his eyes locking on her with a glare so menacing that Violet physically shrank back in her chair. She immediately looked down at her plate, her face pale, and didn't say another word. But she didn't have to. The message had been delivered. She wasn't asking about a hypothetical friend. She was talking about me, and she was warning me. The rest of the meal passed in a clumsy, awkward silence. The pretense was ruined. When we were done, Steve pushed his chair back and put on his host smile again. "Well," he said, "how about we get some fresh air? Go for a walk, just like the old days." And there it was, the main act. The reason for the dinner, for the fake apology, for the whole elaborate play. I knew it was coming. I also knew I couldn't refuse without showing my hand. "Sounds good," I said, forcing a casual tone. "Just let me use the restroom first." I needed a moment. I needed a few seconds alone, behind a locked door, to take a breath and prepare myself for whatever or whoever was waiting for me outside. The curtain had fallen on the cozy family drama. Whatever was coming next, it wasn't going to be a walk down memory lane. Inside the small, sterile guest bathroom, I leaned against the door and closed my eyes, just for a second. The muffled sound of Steve's forced laughter from the dining room seemed a world away. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on my face, the shock of it a welcome jolt to my senses. Water dripped from my chin onto the white porcelain sink. I looked up and met my own eyes in the mirror. I saw a 65-year-old man, his face etched with a weariness that went deeper than just one night. But my eyes, I was relieved to see, were not defeated. They were steady. They were watchful. My mind raced through the possibilities, each one worse than the last. What could I do? Call the police? I could just imagine how that would sound. An old man, rambling about his son's dinner party, a nervous daughter-in-law, and a bad feeling in his gut. They'd thank me for my time and tell me to get some rest. They would think I was going senile. No, there was no help to be found there. I had to gather more than just a feeling. I had to see this twisted play through to its final act. I had to walk onto the stage and find the proof myself. I took one last deep breath, dried my face, and opened the door. Steve was waiting for me in the hallway, his foot tapping impatiently on the floor. His jovial host mask was slipping, revealing the anxious predator underneath. "Ready for that walk, Dad?" he asked, his voice a little too bright. I put my hand on my stomach and gave a slight grimace. "You know, son," I said, letting a little strain into my voice, "I think that rich food and the wine might have hit me a little harder than I expected. My head's spinning a bit. I think I'm just going to walk home alone, if you don't mind. The fresh air might do me some good." I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, quickly masked. This clearly wasn't part of the script. The plan, whatever it was, must have involved him being with me. But he recovered in a heartbeat, his smile returning. "Of course, Dad. Whatever you think is best." He probably figured a lone old man on a dark street was an even easier target. He walked me to the door and clapped me on the shoulder. "Be careful, then," he said. And the way he said the word careful felt less like a concern and more like a threat. The night air was cool, but it did little to calm the frantic energy inside me. The suburban street was eerily quiet. The houses were dark, their occupants already settled in for the night. The only light came from the sickly orange glow of the streetlights, which cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance and twist at the edge of my vision. Every small sound was amplified in the silence. The dry, skittering of fallen leaves across the asphalt sounded like footsteps. The low whistle of the wind through the bare branches of the oak trees sounded like a whisper. I picked up my pace, my shoes making soft, rhythmic sounds on the pavement. My heart was a steady drum against my ribs. The silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt predatory. It was the heavy, watchful silence of a place where a hunter is waiting patiently for its prey. I couldn't shake the feeling, the primal instinct, that I was not alone. Right then, I felt a vibration in my pocket. My phone. I pulled it out, my hand slightly trembling. A text from an unknown number. My thumb slid across the screen, my blood running cold as I read the words. It was a short, simple message. "Don't forget to look around." My breath caught in my throat. I knew in an instant who it was from. Violet. She had found a way to bypass the guard at her side. This was it. The moment my gut feeling solidified into a hard, terrifying fact. The danger wasn't in my head. It was real. My fingers fumbled with the screen as I typed back a single word, a test to be absolutely sure. Who? The reply came back so fast it was as if she'd been waiting with her finger hovering over the screen. This is a rescue. 2 words. And they confirmed everything. My fear, my suspicion, the reason for the fake dinner. This wasn't just a warning. Violet was actively trying to save me. I followed her first instruction, my head snapping up, my eyes scanning the dark street in every direction. And then I saw it. About half a block behind me, a large black sedan was coasting along the curb, its headlights off. It moved without a sound, a shark gliding through dark water. It was keeping its distance, but its presence was a clear, unmistakable threat. Silent and deadly. My mind started working fast. I made a quick decision. A test. At the next intersection, I took a sharp right onto a smaller, darker side street. I didn't look back, but I listened. A few seconds later, I heard the quiet crunch of tires turning onto the same street. They were following. There was no more room for doubt. The friendly walk home had just become a hunt. And I was the prey. I broke into a run. It wasn't the easy, limber run of my youth. It was the desperate, clumsy scramble of a 65-year-old man whose heart was already working overtime. Each step was an effort. The heavy, clumsy pounding of my own feet on the pavement a frantic soundtrack to my escape. A searing pain started to build in my lungs. I could hear the sedan accelerating behind me, its engine now a low growl. Then I heard the sickening sound of car doors clicking open. I risked a glance over my shoulder. The car was still rolling as 2 large, dark figures jumped out, their heavy shoes hitting the sidewalk with a slap that echoed in the night. And they were coming after me. My lungs burned and every muscle in my legs screamed in protest. I'd run until I couldn't run anymore, finally ducking into the deep shadows of a lumber warehouse I knew from my years in the business. I squeezed myself into the narrow gap behind a stack of old wooden crates, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to make myself as small as possible. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, mildew, and the dry, sweet scent of sawdust. It was a smell that had once brought me comfort, but now it only seemed to trap the sound of my own ragged breathing. I pressed a hand against my chest, trying to will my heart to slow down. It was pounding so violently I was sure they could hear it from the street. Through a crack between the crates, I could see the wide entrance of the warehouse. The 2 men who had chased me from the car entered the space, moving slowly, their large frames silhouetted against the weak glow of the streetlights outside. They didn't speak. They just moved with a quiet, methodical purpose, their heads turning from side to side, scanning the darkness. That silence was the most terrifying part. It wasn't the frantic, angry search of common thugs. It was the patient, disciplined movement of professional hunters. And I was the prey they were looking for. Panic is a blinding fog, but deep within it, my mind was racing. I knew this place. I'd been here 100 times over the years to pick up supplies. My memory, sharpened by adrenaline, started to map out the interior. I knew there was a small service door at the back, one that led out into a narrow alleyway on the other side of the block. It was a chance. But to get there, I'd have to cross a 20-foot stretch of open concrete, a dead zone directly under a single, buzzing security light. It was a terrible risk. But staying here, huddled behind these crates, wasn't an option either. It was only a matter of time before their methodical search brought them to my hiding spot. I had to move. I had to take the gamble. I was tensing my muscles, preparing to make a break for it, when I heard their voices for the first time. They were low and rough, laced with a growing frustration. "Where the hell did the old man go?" the first one grumbled, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. The second man answered, his tone dripping with annoyance. "Look, I don't know, but we gotta find him. Steve's not gonna pay us for nothing." The name hit me with the physical force of a hammer blow. Steve? My son. He hadn't just been trying to intimidate me, he hadn't just been trying to scare me, he had hired these men. The last, desperate, foolish sliver of hope I had that this was all some terrible misunderstanding, that he would never cross this line, it all evaporated in that single, brutal moment. There was no misunderstanding. This was the plan. This was the walk he had invited me on. Hearing my son's name spoken by the men who were hunting me sparked a strange and profound chemical reaction inside me. The fear didn't vanish entirely, but it was suddenly pushed down, suppressed by something far colder and heavier. It was a feeling of absolute, crystalline certainty, a brutal clarity. I realized in that instant that the pain of this betrayal was somehow sharper, deeper, and more terrifying than the fear of dying. My terror was no longer about a random, violent encounter. This was personal. This was a story about a father and a son. This was no longer a flight from strangers. It was a confrontation with the unbearable truth that my own flesh and blood, the boy I had raised, wanted me gone. And that truth, as horrible as it was, gave me an unexpected advantage. Their conversation told me they were getting impatient, and impatient men get careless. As if to prove my point, one of them kicked an empty 55-gallon drum in frustration. The loud metallic clang boomed through the warehouse, a ringing, angry sound that covered all others. That was my chance. While their attention was focused on the noise, I moved. I pushed myself away from the crates, staying low to the ground, my body screaming in protest. I moved along the wall, using the deepest shadows as my path. Every step was deliberate, my old work boots placed softly on the concrete floor. My heart was still hammering, but its rhythm had changed. It was no longer the frantic, panicked drumming of a cornered animal. It was now the steady, powerful beat of a man with a singular purpose: to survive. Not just to draw another breath, but to live, to make sure the truth of this night saw the light of day. You know, in that moment, hiding in the dark, I realized that trust is the most fragile thing in the world. You can spend a lifetime building it, cementing it with love and sacrifice, but it can be utterly destroyed in a single second, by a single word. Have you ever had to face a harsh truth like that? A moment when your belief in someone was completely and irrevocably shattered? It's a hard feeling to describe, and if you've been through it, I'd like to hear your story in the comments. I burst through the heavy service door at the back of the warehouse and into the night. The alley was dark, narrow, and smelled of stale beer and damp garbage. But to me, in that moment, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. It was the path to freedom. My lungs were on fire and my legs felt like lead, but I knew I couldn't stop. I didn't run anymore. Running would draw attention. Instead, I forced myself into a fast, purposeful walk, my head down, moving out of the alley and merging onto the better-lit sidewalks of the main street. I tried to look as normal as possible, just another man on his way home, but my heart was still a wild drum against my ribs. I resisted the overwhelming urge to look over my shoulder, convinced I would see the black sedan gliding silently behind me. I focused on the simple mechanics of movement, on the rhythm of my own footsteps on the concrete. One foot in front of the other. That was my only goal. Just keep moving, putting more distance between me and the warehouse, between me and the horrifying truth I'd learned inside it. With every block, the sounds of the city grew a little louder, and the predatory silence of the hunt began to fade. A few more blocks, and I finally felt safe enough to stop. I found a recessed doorway belonging to a closed bookstore and pressed myself into the shadows, my back against the cool brick. My hands were still shaking from the adrenaline. I knew I needed help, but my mind was clear on one thing. I couldn't call 911. I couldn't risk being dismissed as a confused old man having a paranoid episode. I needed someone who would believe me without question, someone whose trust I didn't have to earn. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the contacts, my thumb moving past the names of acquaintances and doctors. Then, I stopped on a name I hadn't had to call in years, a name anchored in my memory as a synonym for help. Martin. We'd known each other since we were kids playing baseball in the same dusty high school field. Now, he was a detective with the city police, a man I trusted without reservation. I pressed the call button. The sound of the phone ringing in my ears seemed to stretch on for an eternity, each pulse a lifetime of waiting. Finally, a voice answered, thick with sleep but solid as oak. "Lewis, what's going on? You're calling me at this hour?" Just hearing his familiar, steady voice was like a dam breaking inside me. A measure of the crushing weight I'd been carrying for the last few days lifted off my chest. The words came spilling out of me in a frantic, shaky torrent. I told him everything, my voice low and urgent. I told him about the dinner, the calculated apology from Steve, and the terrified look in Violet's eyes. I told him about her cryptic messages, the black car that had followed me, and the chase through the dark streets. And most importantly, I told him about the two men in the warehouse and the single damning sentence I had overheard. There was no hesitation in Martin's voice, no disbelief. I could almost hear the gears of his professional mind turning over the phone line. He listened intently, his silence punctuated only by a few sharp, clarifying questions. When I was finished, he didn't waste a second on sympathy. He shifted immediately into action. "Okay, Lewis. Listen to me carefully," he said, his voice now crisp and fully awake. "Stay right where you are. Send me your current location right now. Do not go home. Is that clear? Do not call anyone else. I'm on my way." His professionalism was a lifeline in the chaotic storm of my fear. His calm, decisive commands took my frantic, swirling panic and forged it into a plan. In the space of a 30-second phone call, I had gone from being a lone man running for his life to being part of a team. I was no longer alone in this fight. I had an ally, and he was a detective. I sent him my location as a dropped pin on a map. I was in a small, deserted city park, just a patch of grass with a few benches. I found one under the pale, lonely glow of a streetlight and sat down, the cold of the metal seeping through my clothes. And then I waited. For the next 15 minutes, the world felt completely surreal. The quiet park, the distant hum of traffic, the cool night air. It all felt so normal. It made the events of the past few hours feel like a terrible nightmare I was about to wake from. Was it possible I had imagined it all? The thought flickered in my exhausted mind. But then I looked down at my hands, resting on my knees in the dim light. The angry red scratches I'd gotten from squeezing behind the wooden crates were still there, stark and real against my skin. The dull ache in my lungs from my desperate run was a physical reminder. This was real, all of it. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my throat. The waiting was the hardest part, but it was a different kind of waiting now. I was no longer waiting for the next attack. I was waiting for help. I was waiting for the fight to truly begin. The slow, heavy wheels of justice were finally beginning to turn. Martin's unmarked car pulled up to the curb faster than I thought possible. The moment I slid into the passenger seat and shut the heavy door, a profound sense of safety washed over me. The first I'd felt in what seemed like an eternity. The controlled, quiet interior of the car was a world away from the predatory silence of the streets I'd just escaped. He didn't say much as we drove, just handed me a cold bottle of water, which I drank down in 3 long swallows, my hand still trembling slightly. We drove straight to the downtown precinct. The building was a cold, modern block of concrete and glass that seemed to hum under the harsh fluorescent lights. Inside, the air smelled strongly of stale coffee, disinfectant, and paperwork. There was an impersonal, bureaucratic chill to the place that was the exact opposite of a home. But it had something I desperately needed right then. It had order. It had procedure. It had the unyielding weight of the law. For the first time all night, I felt like I was on solid ground. Martin led me through a maze of busy corridors to a small, quiet office. He offered me a chair, and I sat down, the exhaustion of the night finally starting to sink into my bones. A young, uniformed officer sat across the desk from me, her fingers poised over a keyboard. Martin stood by the door, a silent, reassuring presence. "Okay, Lewis," he said gently. "From the top. Tell us everything." And so I did. I told the story again, but this time was different. It wasn't the frantic, panicked recounting over the phone. Here, in the calm of this small room, the words came out more clearly, more chronologically. I spoke of Steve's visit, the impossible demand, the calculated rage, and the broken photograph of my wife. I described the dinner, the fake smiles, the terror in Violet's eyes, and her coded warning. I recounted the chase, the dark sedan, and finally, the damning words I had overheard in the shadows of the warehouse. As I spoke, the officer typed, her fingers flying across the keys. The rhythmic clacking was a strangely comforting sound. It was the sound of my personal nightmare being transformed, line by line, into something solid and official. It was no longer just a chaotic fear swirling inside my own head. It was becoming a report, a case file. It was becoming real. When I finished, my voice was hoarse. I took out my phone and handed it to Martin. "This is the number she texted from," I said. He took the phone, his brow furrowed in concentration as he examined the messages. After a moment, he nodded. "An unregistered burner phone, most likely. But we can trace where it was purchased. We can pull the tower records for the location you were in. This is good, Lewis. This helps a lot." The simple act of handing over that phone, of giving him a tangible piece of the puzzle, felt momentous. It was a transfer of the burden. In that moment, I felt a crucial shift inside me. I was no longer just a passive victim, a man to whom terrible things had happened. I was an active participant in what came next. I was providing evidence. I was cooperating with the law to seek out justice. I was starting to fight back. As if on cue, the police radio on Martin's belt crackled to life with a burst of static. He listened intently for a moment, his expression unreadable, and spoke a few quiet words into it. When he was done, he turned to me, a grim but satisfied look on his face. "Well, that was fast," he said. "A patrol car picked up the black sedan a few blocks from the warehouse based on your description. The 2 gentlemen inside, both of whom have impressive rap sheets, are being detained and brought in for questioning." The news hit me with a wave of relief so powerful I felt lightheaded. Another heavy weight lifted. They had them. The 2 shadowy figures from my nightmares were in custody. They weren't out there in the night anymore. Martin wasn't finished. He looked down at a note the young officer had just handed him. "And about that phone number," he said, his eyes finding mine. They were filled with a kind of weary sympathy. "We ran the preliminary location data. The texts were sent from a phone located inside your son's house, At the exact time you were there for dinner. The phone was registered 2 days ago, paid for in cash, under the name Violet Shaw." He paused, letting the information sink in. "She was incredibly brave, Lewis," he said, his voice softer now. "She took a hell of a risk to warn you." I knew she had, but to hear it stated as a fact, confirmed by the police, gave her bravery a new and powerful dimension. She wasn't just an unwilling participant who felt a pang of guilt. She was a witness. She was a woman who had seen a terrible wrong being planned and had chosen to stand on the side of what was right. Martin insisted I not go home that night, not until they understood the full scope of the situation. He arranged for a room at a small anonymous hotel a few blocks away. I lay in the stiff, unfamiliar bed for hours, staring at the textured patterns on the ceiling. My mind was still racing, replaying every horrifying detail of the past 12 hours. But as I lay there, I realized this sleeplessness was different from the kind I had known before. This wasn't the frantic, fearful insomnia of a man who didn't know what the darkness held. This was the quiet, alert sleeplessness of a man waiting for the dawn. I was waiting for a new day. A day where the things that festered in the shadows would finally be dragged into the light. A day for truth. And a day for justice. I woke in the gray, unfamiliar light of the hotel room with a sense of hopeful anticipation. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I hadn't been plagued by nightmares. I was a man waiting for the dawn. That feeling of purpose, however, was shattered by the shrill ring of the telephone on the nightstand. It was Martin. His voice on the other end was different from the night before. The reassuring calm was gone, replaced by a grim, heavy seriousness. "Lewis," he said, his voice low, "those two guys we picked up, they've been talking all night. They sang like a canary choir." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavy with unspoken things. "I think you should come down to the precinct. There are some things you need to know, and you should hear them from me, in person." A cold dread, sharp and immediate, washed over me, extinguishing the fragile warmth of the morning's hope. I had spent the night thinking I finally understood the full scope of my son's betrayal. Martin's tone told me I was wrong. What, I thought as I numbly got dressed, what could possibly be worse than what I already knew? I took a taxi back to the station, the city landscape sliding past the window in a blur. I felt like a man on his way to hear a terminal diagnosis. Martin was waiting for me, and he led me back to the same small, quiet office from the night before. He didn't offer me coffee. He didn't waste time with small talk. A thick manila folder sat in the center of his metal desk. He slid it across the polished surface toward me. "This is the transcript from the interview with one of them," he said, his voice flat. "The driver. He was eager to make a deal." My hands felt strangely numb as I opened the folder. The pages were filled with dense blocks of text, a formal, typed confession of the night's events. I started to read. The words on the first few pages swam before my eyes, but the story they told was a sickening confirmation of what I had already pieced together. They admitted they had been hired by Steve. Their job was to follow me after the dinner, to corner me in a dark place, and to scare the hell out of me. The price for this act of terror against their own father? $10,000. I felt a wave of nausea. He had put a price on my fear. But that wasn't the worst of it. Not even close. I turned the page and my eyes scanned down the transcript. That's when I saw the detail that made the air leave my lungs in a single, silent gasp. The room suddenly felt cold, the walls closing in. Steve hadn't just hired them to frighten me. He had given them a key piece of information, a secret he had known for years, a piece of knowledge shared between a father and a son in moments of trust and vulnerability. He had told them about my heart condition. The words on the page laid out the plan in cold, bureaucratic language. His instructions to these two thugs had been chillingly specific. They were not to touch me. They were not to physically harm me in any way that could be traced. Their job was to hunt me, to chase me down, to make me run, to trap me in a place where I felt there was no escape. They were instructed to create a scenario of absolute, overwhelming terror and physical exertion. The goal, the transcript stated in plain, brutal terms, was to induce a massive, fatal heart attack. The architecture of the plan, in all its monstrous perfection, became horrifyingly clear. If I had died on that dark street clutching my chest, it would have been a tragedy, an unfortunate accident. A 65-year-old man with a history of heart problems had a terrible scare and his body simply gave out. No weapon, no bruises, no signs of a struggle, nothing for the police to investigate. It would be a clean, natural death. And my son, my grieving, heartbroken son, would have been there to comfort his wife, accept the condolences of our friends, and quietly, patiently, wait to inherit everything I had spent my life building. He had found a way to murder me without laying a finger on me. He had weaponized my own aging, failing body against me. The folder slipped from my numb fingers, the pages scattering across the floor. The small office seemed to tilt, the fluorescent lights buzzing violently overhead. The last few days had been a journey into a deep, dark canyon of betrayal, and I had foolishly thought I had finally reached the bottom. I was wrong. This was the bottom, a place of absolute darkness. This wasn't the desperate, greedy act of a son who wanted his inheritance. This was the cold-blooded, meticulous calculation of a murderer. My son had planned my death. He had researched the method, hired the executioners, and identified my weakest point with the precision of a trained assassin. In that moment, something inside me finally and irrevocably broke. Any last, lingering ember of love I held for him, any ghost of the little boy on my shoulders at Navy Pier, any shred of paternal duty, it was all incinerated in the heat of this monstrous truth. The love didn't just die, it was annihilated. And in its place, there wasn't anger, there wasn't even grief. There was nothing. Only a vast, cold, silent emptiness. A void where a son used to be. I just sat there in the sterile quiet of Martin's office, the empty space inside me echoing the silence of the room. The horrific words from the transcript seemed to be branded on the inside of my eyelids. My son had planned my death. The thought was so monstrous, so fundamentally unnatural that my mind couldn't fully process it. I was adrift in the vast, cold emptiness of it all, a man hollowed out by the truth. Martin, to his credit, gave me the space I needed. He didn't offer any empty platitudes or clumsy reassurances. He simply waited, a patient, solid presence in the corner of the room. After a few minutes that felt like an hour, he quietly got up and came back with a steaming styrofoam cup of coffee, placing it gently on the desk in front of me. The warmth from the cup seeped into my cold, numb hands. "I know this is a lot to take in, Louis," he said, his voice soft. "But I need you to hear me. You are not alone in this." I looked up at my old friend, at his tired but steady eyes. And his words, so simple and direct, were the first thing that had managed to pierce through the thick, suffocating fog of my shock. It was a lifeline. It was the first time in nearly 24 hours that I felt like I could actually take a full, deep breath. The emptiness was still there, but for the first time it didn't feel infinite. Martin went on to tell me about Violet. He explained that as soon as I had left their house for that fateful walk, she had made a call. Not to the police, but to him. She had found his number in my old address book from years ago. She'd overheard a phone call Steve had made earlier in the day with one of the thugs, and while she didn't know the full murderous detail, she knew enough to be terrified. She knew they were planning to corner me, to hurt me. She had been too frightened of Steve to confront him directly, too scared to try and stop me from leaving. So she had found another way. In secret, in silence, she had found a way to sound the alarm. She had chosen her conscience over her own safety. The story was almost too much to comprehend, another layer of shock on top of everything else. And Martin wasn't done. "She's agreed to give a full statement, Lewis," he said, leaning forward. "She's going to testify. She's going to tell the DA everything she knows about Steve's gambling debts, about the threats he was getting from loan sharks, about the whole twisted plan he cooked up for that night. Her testimony, it's the key. It gives us motive. It connects all the dots." The news was like a powerful beam of light cutting through the oppressive darkness in my mind. The case against my son wasn't just going to be built on the self-serving confession of a hired criminal. It was going to be anchored by the truth, spoken by someone on the inside, someone who had witnessed his descent firsthand. Hope, an emotion I thought had been permanently extinguished, began to flicker faintly back to life. I thought about Violet, a woman I had known for years, but perhaps had never truly seen. In my mind, she had always been a quiet, almost timid presence, anxious to please and quick to retreat. I suppose I had always thought of her as a bit weak, someone who was easily swept along by my son's loud, demanding personality. But I was so wrong. Weakness doesn't look like that. What she did, risking her home, her security, and her own physical safety to stand up against the man she lived with, the man she depended on, all to protect a father-in-law she barely knew, that wasn't weakness. That required a kind of profound, earth-shaking courage I could barely comprehend. Her actions were a powerful reminder that real strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just quietly, bravely, does the right thing when no one else will. Her bravery gave me a surge of strength. It was as if her courage was contagious, a flame that had jumped across the cold distance between us and reignited something in me. I thought if she, in a position far more dangerous and complicated than my own, could find the courage to stand up for the truth, then so could I. The feeling of isolation that had been crushing me began to recede. We were an alliance now, an unlikely, unspoken partnership forged from the ashes of my son's betrayal. We would face this together. We would see it through and make sure that justice was done. Martin let the silence sit for a moment longer before he spoke again, his voice pulling me back to the present. "We're bringing Steve in for questioning now," he said. "He's on his way over." He looked at me carefully. "Do you want to see him? You don't have to. No one would blame you if you didn't." I considered it for a long moment. A powerful, visceral part of me wanted to say no. I wanted to walk out of that police station, go somewhere far away, and never lay eyes on my son's face again. But another part of me, a part that was growing stronger by the second, knew that wasn't possible. I knew I had to do this. I needed to face him, not with the wounded heart of a father, but with the clear, steady eyes of his victim. I needed to stand in the same room with the truth, in all its ugliness. I needed this chapter of my life to have a true and final ending. "I want to," I said, and I was surprised by how steady and firm my own voice sounded. "I want to see him." Martin led me down a quiet, sterile hallway to an interrogation room. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind me, the muffled sounds of the busy police station vanished, replaced by a deep, humming silence. The room was small and brutally simple, painted a pale, institutional gray that seemed to absorb all warmth and color. There was a single metal table bolted to the floor and 3 hard plastic chairs. The air was cold, clinical, and completely devoid of emotion. It was a room designed for stripping away lies and getting to the hard, unvarnished truth. A large, dark pane of one-way glass took up most of the far wall, a silent, unblinking eye. I knew Martin and the others were back there, watching, listening. This wasn't just for me. This was official. I walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down, placing my hands flat on the cool, unforgiving surface. And then, I waited. A few minutes later, the door opened again, and 2 uniformed officers escorted my son, Steve, into the room. The transformation was staggering. Gone was the arrogant rage from my living room. Gone was the slick, repentant performer from the phone call. Dressed in a bright orange jumpsuit, he seemed to have physically shrunken. All the bluster and anger had been stripped away, leaving behind a man who looked small, frail, and utterly pathetic. When he saw me sitting there, a strange, desperate flicker of hope ignited in his eyes. I could see the thought forming in his mind as clearly as if he'd spoken it aloud. He thought I was his final play. He believed, even after everything, that I was there as his father, his get-out-of-jail-free card, the man who would somehow make this all go away. He still didn't get it. After all this, he still didn't understand a single thing. The officers guided him into the chair opposite me and then left, the door closing with a solid, definitive thud. The moment we were alone, his final performance began. The tears started to well in his eyes, his voice thick with a practiced theatrical sorrow. "Dad," he choked out, the word a desperate plea. "Dad, thank God. You have to tell them. It's all a misunderstanding." He leaned forward, his voice a conspiratorial whisper, as if we were partners trying to solve a problem. He told me he was just scared about the money. He said he only wanted to spook me a little, to make me understand how serious it was. He swore he never would have let those men actually harm me. He begged me, pleaded with me, peppering his lies with fragments of old memories, of fishing trips and holidays, a last, desperate attempt to activate the father-son bond he himself had already murdered. He was playing a part, an appeal to the ghost of a father he thought still lived inside of me. I said nothing. I just sat there, my hands still flat on the table, and I watched him. I let him exhaust his arsenal of excuses, his portfolio of lies. I let him perform his grief, his regret, his terror. And I looked deep into his eyes, searching. I was not searching for the son I had lost. I was searching for a single, solitary flicker of genuine remorse. There was none. All I saw was the raw, animal terror of a creature caught in a trap. The tears streaming down his face were not for the pain he had caused me. They were not for the betrayal, not for the memory of his mother, not for the family he had destroyed. He was crying for himself. He was weeping for his own pathetic future. My silence was a wall he couldn't break through. It was a mirror that reflected the ugliness of his performance right back at him. His words began to falter, his sobs becoming more frantic as his act failed to get a response. The actor was losing his audience. My steady, quiet gaze was a judgment he could not withstand. Finally, his words ran out. His desperate pleading dissolved into a series of choked, ragged breaths. The room fell silent again, the only sound his pathetic, gulping sobs. The stage was now mine. When I finally spoke, my voice was a stranger in my own ears. It was calm. It was flat. It was as cold and devoid of emotion as the metal table between us. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I simply delivered a finding of fact. A final, unappealable judgment. "The night," I began, my eyes locked on his, "the night you hired men to hunt me through dark alleys, hoping my heart would stop." I let the words hang in the air for a long moment, forcing him to see the scene in his own mind. My son died. I saw the last flicker of hope in his eyes die, replaced by a look of horrified confusion. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer another lie, another excuse, but I gave him no chance. I stood up from my chair, the legs scraping loudly against the concrete floor. I looked down at the hollowed-out stranger sitting before me, the man who wore my son's face. "You are not my son anymore." I spoke the words, and with them a lifetime of love and pain was severed. I turned my back on him and walked toward the door. I didn't look back. I could hear him start to scream my name behind me, a desperate, wailing sound of pure panic. But it sounded distant, like a noise from another world that could no longer reach me, could no longer touch me. I knocked once on the door, and an officer immediately opened it from the outside. I stepped out into the hallway, and the heavy door of the interrogation room swung shut behind me. It closed with a solid, definitive thud. It closed a chapter of my life, a chapter of profound pain and betrayal, but a chapter that was, at long last, finally over. Walking out of the police station and into the harsh afternoon sun, I didn't feel the catharsis of victory. There was no sense of triumph, no feeling of a battle won. There was only a profound and heavy emptiness, a hollow space where a massive part of my life used to be. My final words to Steve echoed in the sudden quiet of my own mind, playing on a loop. "You are not my son anymore." Each word had been a deliberate, necessary cut, meant to sever a toxic bond. But I understood now that a blade like that cuts both ways. In severing him from my life, I had also cut away a piece of my own heart. I had done what I had to do. I had done the right thing. But I was learning the hard way that the right thing doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels like a wound from which you might never recover. I took a cab home. When I put my key in the lock and stepped inside, the silence of the house rushed out to meet me. It had always been a quiet house, but this was a different kind of quiet. It was a loud, cavernous silence that emphasized my solitude. The house suddenly felt too large, its rooms too empty, for just one person. My eyes immediately went to the dining room table, where the jagged line of the crack I had tried to mend was still visible. Then to the mantelpiece, where the broken family photograph sat in its shattered frame. They were no longer angry symbols of a recent violation. They had become something quieter and sadder. They were tombstones. Small, quiet monuments to a relationship that was now officially dead and buried. I walked slowly through the rooms, my hand trailing along the back of a familiar armchair, my fingers brushing against the spines of the books on the shelf. Everything was in its place, exactly as it had been that morning. The house was the same, but I was not. A fundamental part of my identity, the part that was Steve's father, had been officially and irrevocably executed in that cold, gray interrogation room. And I wasn't sure yet who this new person, the one left behind in the aftermath, was supposed to be. That night, sleep was once again an impossibility. But it was different from the sleepless nights that had come before. It wasn't a night of fear or of shock or of anxious waiting. It was a night of profound and heavy contemplation. I made a pot of chamomile tea, the simple ritual a small comfort in the vast quiet. I sat in my old lazy boy in the living room, cradling the warm mug in my hands, and stared out the large window at the dark, sleeping houses of my neighbors. My thoughts, for the first time, weren't on Steve. They were on Martha. I found myself talking to her in my head, a conversation I'd had 1,000 times since she'd been gone. What would you have done, Martha? Did I do the right thing? I could almost hear her voice, clear and practical as always, cutting through all the emotional fog. I knew what she would say. She had always been stronger than me in that way, always able to see the hard truth of things without flinching. She would have understood. She would have known that my final words to Steve were not an act of punishment or revenge. They were an act of protection. I was finally, after all these years, honoring the second half of the promise I had made to her on her deathbed. I was no longer letting him destroy me. I was protecting myself, and I was protecting the life and the home that we had built together. As the first, faint gray light of dawn began to creep into the sky, a strange sense of peace settled over me. The deep, aching pain of the loss was still there, a permanent part of my landscape now. But the torment, the guilt, the agonizing self-doubt, that was gone. I realized I had fulfilled my duty as a father, in the hardest, most brutal way imaginable, by setting a boundary that could not be crossed. For 20 years, I had tried to teach him about life with my checkbook, with my patience, with my endless second chances. It had all failed. With my final act, I had taught him the only lesson he had ever refused to learn, that every action, sooner or later, has a final and unavoidable consequence. I knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. My quiet life was over for the foreseeable future. There would be legal proceedings, a trial, testimonies. There would be the curious, pitying stares from neighbors, the awkward phone calls from old friends who had heard the news. There would be days when the grief would feel as fresh and raw as it did in that interrogation room. But as I sat there, watching the sun rise, I knew I was ready for it. The fear and the doubt that had been my constant companions were gone, replaced by a quiet, unshakable resolve. My fight was no longer about a broken relationship or a lost son. That battle was over. The new fight was for something clearer, something purer. I was fighting for the truth. I was fighting for justice, and that, I knew, was a fight worth fighting. Making that final decision, saying those final words, was the hardest thing I have ever done in my life. Sometimes, in order to protect the core of your family, you have to make a choice that cuts off one of its own members. It's a painful, heartbreaking paradox. Have you ever been faced with a tough love decision like that? A moment where you had to be the one to draw a hard line for the long-term good of someone you care about. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. The weeks that followed my final confrontation with Steve were a strange, disorienting blur of legal procedure. My life, which had once been defined by the familiar rhythms of my workshop and the quiet comfort of my home, was now governed by a calendar of appointments in sterile offices with lawyers and prosecutors. I met with the victim's advocate from the district attorney's office, a kind but firm woman who walked me through what to expect. I told my story so many times that it began to lose its sharp, painful edges, the words hardening into a kind of script, a narrative that felt almost like it had happened to someone else. The world of the law was a cold and precise place. It was a realm of facts, of evidence, of statutes and precedents. There was no room for the messy, chaotic pain of a family's implosion. Emotions were translated into motives, betrayals were filed as conspiracies, and a broken heart was simply inadmissible. And in a strange way, I found that sterile, methodical environment to be a profound comfort. It took the formless, overwhelming horror of what my son had done and gave it a structure, a name, and a clear path forward. It was a process I could trust. I knew Violet was navigating the same cold world. Martin kept me informed, telling me that her formal testimony had been incredibly detailed and compelling. Her courage was staggering. She didn't just speak of the events of that night. She had provided the context that gave them their horrifying clarity. She gave the investigators access to Steve's computer, where they found his extensive history with online gambling sites. She had records of angry, threatening voicemails from his creditors he'd tried to hide. She laid out, piece by painful piece, the full picture of a man in a desperate, spiraling freefall of debt and moral decay. In doing so, she must have known she was dismantling her own life, yet she chose the truth. I would never forget that courage. As expected, Steve's expensive defense attorney attempted to construct an alternate reality from the facts. They spun a tale of a devoted son merely panicked by his overwhelming debt, a man who deeply loved his father. The whole chase, they argued, was a foolish, misguided, but ultimately harmless attempt to scare me into helping him. They even tried to paint me as a distant, controlling figure, a harsh father whose refusal to open his wallet had pushed his desperate son over the edge. I listened to these characterizations when Martin relayed them to me, and I felt absolutely nothing. It was like listening to someone talk about strangers in a poorly written novel. The words were just noise, empty shells with no power to wound me. I was now armed with the cold, hard weight of the truth, and their fictions simply shattered against it. The day of the trial finally arrived. I woke that morning and, with deliberate care, put on my best suit, a dark navy wool I had owned for 20 years, the one I saved for weddings, and, now, for the funeral of the son I once had. I didn't wear it to impress the jury or the judge. I wore it as a sign of respect. It was respect for the institution that was giving my truth a platform. And more importantly, it was a final act of respect for myself. It was an armor, not of steel, but of dignity. I drove to the courthouse and I took a seat in the front row, right behind the prosecutor's table. I sat with my back straight and my hands resting on my knees. I stared straight ahead. I didn't have to say a word. My presence there, quiet and steady, was its own form of testimony. When the bailiffs led Steve into the courtroom, he wouldn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor in front of him. I was shocked by his appearance. He was thin, his skin a pale, unhealthy gray. The expensive suit his lawyer had probably picked out for him hung loosely on his diminished frame. The snarling, cornered animal from my living room, the hateful stranger from the police transcript, that man was gone. In his place was just a hollowed-out man, a faint and pathetic shadow. And as I looked at him, I realized with a sense of surprise that the hatred I had felt was gone too. All that remained was a distant, clinical pity. It was not forgiveness. It was the detached sadness a man might feel looking at the wreckage of a beautiful car after a terrible crash. A profound sorrow for the life he could have had, for the man he could have been, for the future he had so thoroughly and deliberately thrown away. Given the overwhelming evidence, the testimony of the two men he'd hired, Violet's detailed account of his motives, the damning digital trail of his gambling and debts, the jury didn't take long to deliberate. It felt like no time at all before they were filing back into the jury box, their faces grim and resolved. A hush fell over the courtroom as the foreman handed a slip of paper to the clerk. When the verdict was read aloud, guilty on the charge of conspiracy to commit assault, and on all the other related charges, the words seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. There were no gasps from the gallery, no cries from his side of the aisle. Just a profound, heavy silence. I didn't feel a surge of joy. There was no celebratory cheer in my heart. There was only a deep, profound sense of relief. It was the feeling of a man who had been carrying an impossibly heavy weight for years and had finally, at long last, been allowed to set it down. The great, slow wheels of justice had turned. Slowly, to be sure, but with an undeniable and final certainty. The day of the sentencing arrived under a flat, gray sky, the kind of colorless, oppressive morning that seemed to perfectly match the mood in my soul. I drove to the courthouse alone. Martin had offered to come with me, but I had declined. This was a final, solitary journey I needed to make myself. Violet had chosen not to be there, a decision I understood completely. She had already done more than enough, shown more courage than anyone had a right to ask of her. Her part in this painful chapter was over. Now, I had to see mine through to the end. I took my familiar seat on the hard wooden bench in the courtroom. The room was quiet, filled with a heavy, anxious energy. I kept my eyes fixed on the judge, a man with a full head of silver hair and a stern, weathered face that suggested he had seen the worst of human nature many times before and was not easily impressed by theatrics. I found a strange comfort in his stern demeanor. This was a situation that called for solemnity, not sympathy. Steve's lawyer gave his final plea for leniency. He spoke of a difficult childhood that I didn't recognize, of a gambling addiction that he framed as a clinical disease rather than a series of selfish choices. He painted a picture of a man who was not a monster, but merely a victim of his own compulsions. Then, Steve himself was given the chance to speak. He stood, his hands shackled in front of him, and turned to face me. The tears were flowing freely, his voice thick and broken as he told me how sorry he was. He loved me, he said. He never meant for any of this to happen. I listened to the words and I felt nothing. It was like listening to a bad actor reading from a poorly written script. The apology, if that's what it was, had come far too late, and it rang with the hollow echo of pure self-preservation. His tears were not for me. They were for himself. His words had no meaning because his actions had already told the entire, monstrous truth. The connection that would have allowed those words to land had been severed, and all that was left was empty noise. The judge listened to it all with a patient, stony expression. When they were finished, he let the silence sit in the room for a long moment before he spoke. When he did, his voice was clear, firm, and carried the immense weight of the law. He spoke of the facts of the case, of the evidence presented, but then he spoke of something deeper. He spoke of the sacred trust between a father and a son. He spoke of the unimaginable betrayal of using that trust as a weapon. He spoke of the cold-blooded calculation required for a son to plot against his own father's life, exploiting his medical vulnerabilities for financial gain. He looked directly at Steve, and for the first time I saw my son flinch, truly flinch, under the weight of a judgment he could not manipulate or escape. And then the judge delivered the sentence. For the crime of conspiracy to commit assault, and for the related charges, he said, his voice resonating in the quiet room, this court sentences you to a term of 15 years in the state penitentiary. 15 years. The words seemed to hang in the air. The sharp, definitive crack of the judge's wooden gavel followed a second later. It was the sound of a door slamming shut, the sound of a final, unbreakable end. I took a long, slow breath, the first truly deep breath I'd taken all morning. 15 years. It was a long time. It was, I thought, enough time for a man to sit with the consequences of his actions, to truly reflect on the wreckage he had made of his life. As the bailiffs came forward to lead him away, Steve's head came up, and he looked across the courtroom at me one last time. I tried to read the expression in his eyes. Was it hatred? Was it a final, desperate plea? Was it, after all this, a flicker of genuine remorse? And then, I had the most liberating realization of my entire life. It no longer mattered. His feelings, his fate, his remorse, or lack thereof, they were no longer my burden to carry. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom. As I pushed through the heavy doors and into the main hall, I was surprised to see that the world outside had changed. The oppressive gray clouds of the morning had broken apart, and bright, clear sunlight was streaming through the tall windows. When I stepped outside, the warmth of the sun on my face felt like a benediction. The immense, crushing weight that I had been carrying on my shoulders for months, for years, really, seemed to dissolve in that unexpected warmth. The war was over. The fight was done. Justice, in its own painful, imperfect, and human way, had been served. I didn't go straight home. I found myself driving, without a conscious thought, to the small lake just outside of town, to the quiet spot where Martha and I used to go on warm Sunday afternoons. I parked the car and walked to a bench overlooking the water, which was sparkling in the afternoon sun. I sat there for hours, just watching the gentle waves lap against the shore. I knew the scar this ordeal had left on my soul would never fully disappear. It would always be a part of me, a reminder of how close to the darkness I had come. But for the first time in a very, very long time, I felt a sense of peace. A quiet, deep, and profound peace. I had been tested in a fire I never could have imagined, and I had endured. I had survived. And now, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, I could finally begin to think about what to do with the rest of my life. The day after the sentencing, after a long and dreamless sleep, I woke with a singular, clear thought in my mind. There was one last piece of business to attend to, one final, loose end to tie up. It was an idea that had been quietly taking shape in the back of my mind ever since the night I'd sat in Martin's office and read the transcript of the confession. With the legal battle over, it was time to put my own house in order. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It belonged to David, my lawyer, a calm, steady man who had handled my family's affairs for more than 30 years. When he answered, my voice was firm. "David, it's Louis," I said. "I need to see you. There are some changes we need to make." David's office was on the top floor of a downtown building, with a large window that looked out over the entire city. Sitting there in a soft leather chair across from his wide mahogany desk, I felt a strange sense of clarity and purpose. The city below was bustling with life, a complex machine of people moving in 1,000 different directions, and for the first time I felt like I was moving with it again, not just watching it from the sidelines of my own grief. David had, of course, read about the trial in the papers. He listened with the quiet sympathy of an old friend as I briefly filled him in on the details the news reports had missed. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a deep, weary understanding. He had known my family for a long time. He had seen Steve grow up. He knew this wasn't a simple story. When I had finished, he simply nodded, waiting for me to continue. I got straight to the point. There was no need for preamble. "I want to change my will, David," I said, my voice even and direct. "I want Stephen Shaw's name removed from it entirely. Not a cent. Not a single asset. Nothing." David looked at me over the top of his reading glasses, his expression searching my face. It was his job to make sure I was certain, that I wasn't acting purely out of anger or grief. "Are you absolutely sure about this, Louis?" he asked gently. I met his gaze without wavering and gave a single, firm nod. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Saying the words out loud, Making the decision official in that quiet, formal office was like closing a heavy iron door on the past. It wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of finality. A profound and immediate relief washed over me. It was the final severing of a bond that had long since become a toxic chain. But this wasn't just about cutting someone out. It was about redirecting my life's work toward something that mattered. I instructed David on how to restructure the estate. First, I said, I want a significant portion to go to the charities Martha always supported. I thought of her, and for the first time the memory brought a pure, uncomplicated warmth, not a pang of sadness. Especially the local children's shelter and the literacy program she used to volunteer for. I want her work to continue. And the rest? David asked, already making notes on a legal pad. The rest, I said, I want you to use to set up a trust fund. A substantial one. I want it put in Violet Shaw's name. This was the part that felt the most right, the most necessary. I want her to have a chance to build a new life, a safe and independent life, free from the wreckage my son created. It's the very least I can do to repay her for her extraordinary courage. A few days later, I was back in David's office to sign the new documents. As I held the heavy, expensive pen and wrote my name on the final signature line, I had a moment of profound insight. I finally understood what a legacy truly is. For years, I had thought my legacy was the business I had built, the assets I had accumulated. I thought my legacy was something I would pass on to my son. I was wrong. A legacy isn't the number in a bank account you leave behind or the property you own. A real legacy is the sum of the values you live by and the principles you fight to protect. I had spent my entire life building a world for myself and my family based on the simple tenets of hard work, honesty, and responsibility. I had built it with my own two hands, and I would not, could not, allow that legacy to be corrupted, squandered, and ultimately defined by the greed and malice of a man who stood for none of those things. This final act, this signature, wasn't a punishment. It was an act of preservation. I was protecting the only thing a man truly owns at the end of his life, the integrity of his name. As I signed that new will, I thought a lot about the meaning of that word, legacy. It's so much more than just the stuff we accumulate, the houses or the money in the bank. It's in the values we uphold, the lessons we teach, the quiet examples we set. It's the story that gets told about us when we're gone. What do you want your legacy to be? What is the most important value you hope to leave for the next generation? I'd be interested to read your thoughts. A few weeks after the sentencing, a quiet sort of normalcy began to settle back into my life. The legal storm had passed, leaving behind a vast, calm quiet. One Saturday morning, I stood in my dining room, looking at the oak table Martha and I had loved so much. The ugly, jagged scar from Steve's fist was still there, a permanent reminder of that terrible night. For weeks, I had avoided looking at it. But now, I knew it was time to get to work. I wasn't just going to fix it, I was going to heal it. I spent the entire weekend in my workshop. I didn't try to fill the crack or hide it with putty. Instead, I took my old belt sander and began the long, slow process of taking the entire tabletop down to the bare wood. The work was methodical, purposeful. The loud hum of the sander filled the house, a sound of industry and repair. I moved with the grain, my hands steady, feeling the vibrations in my bones. When the old varnish was gone, I sanded it again by hand, with finer and finer grits of paper, until the surface was as smooth as silk. When I was finally done and had applied a new, clear coat of finish, the table was beautiful again. If you looked closely in the right light, you could still see the faint, ghostly line of the crack. It wasn't perfect. but it was healed, and somehow that felt better than perfect. The following week, I made a phone call I had been putting off. I called Violet. I told her I wanted to take her to lunch to thank her properly. She was hesitant at first, her voice small and uncertain, but in the end, she agreed. We met at a quiet little Italian place downtown. There was a palpable awkwardness between us at first. We were two strangers, after all, bound together only by a shared tragedy. I tried my best to put her at ease. I thanked her again, telling her that her courage had saved my life. She just shook her head slightly, her eyes focused on her water glass. "I just did what was right, Louis," she said softly. After we ate, I passed a plain white envelope across the table to her. She looked at it, confused. Inside were the legal documents for the trust fund I had established in her name. "I need you to understand," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "This isn't charity, and it's not a payment for what you did. This is a fresh start, a chance for you to build your own life on your own terms, completely free from the past and the wreckage he left behind." She carefully opened the envelope and read the first page. Her eyes widened, and she looked up at me, her mouth slightly open. And then, for the very first time since I'd known her, I saw a genuine, unguarded smile spread across her face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief, a dawn of hope breaking through the long night she had endured. In that moment, seeing that smile, I felt a sense of rightness, of a small piece of the world being set straight again. That meeting planted a seed in my mind. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. How many other older folks were out there, suffering the same kind of abuse in silence? How many were being manipulated, threatened, or stolen from by the very people who were supposed to love and care for them? How many of them felt ashamed, isolated, and completely alone, with no idea where to turn for help? The thought took hold of me and wouldn't let go. Maybe my story, my pain, didn't have to end with me. Maybe it could be a warning for some, a source of encouragement for others. The next day, I started my research. I spent hours online learning about organizations, nonprofits, and community groups dedicated to helping victims of elder abuse. My first action was simple. I wrote a substantial check, donating a large portion of the inheritance that would have once gone to Steve, and sent it to a national advocacy center. But I knew I wanted to do more than just give money. I wanted to give a piece of my story. I found a local organization that ran support groups for families, and I contacted their director. I told him I wanted to help, to share my experience completely anonymously. I wanted other men, other fathers, who might be trapped in the same cycle of hope and despair that I had been, to hear from one of their own. I wanted them to know that they weren't alone in their struggle, and I wanted them to know that setting a boundary, saying no, is not a failure of fatherhood. It's one of its greatest and hardest duties. That evening, I took the creased, glassless photograph from the mantelpiece, the one of a smiling family at Navy Pier. I drove it to a small, professional frame shop in town, a place run by a man who took pride in his work. I didn't ask him to find a silver frame like the one that had been broken. That part of the story was over. Instead, I chose a simple, sturdy frame made of solid oak, its grain warm and strong like my refinished table. When I brought it home and placed it back in its honored spot on the mantel, it looked different. It looked complete. The creased line across the photo was still there, a faint, white scar visible behind the new, clean glass. It would always be there. It was part of the story now. A story of brokenness, yes. But as I looked at it, I realized it was also something more. It was a story of survival and of rebirth. My story began with the frantic ringing of a doorbell on a rainy afternoon, and it ends here, today, in a quiet and hard-won peace. It's been a long journey, one that took me through the darkest corners of love and betrayal, of fear, and, finally, of forgiveness. In a way, I had to lose a son. But in the process of that terrible loss, I managed to find myself again. I learned that real strength isn't found in limitless giving or in endless patience. I learned that true strength is found in the quiet courage of knowing where your own boundaries are and then defending them, not with anger, but with a resolve as calm and as solid as old oak. People who have heard my story sometimes ask me if I've forgiven Steve. It's a fair question, but my answer seems to surprise them. The truth is, I don't really think about forgiving him anymore. His life is his own now, and his path is one I can no longer walk. The forgiveness that I needed to find, the forgiveness that truly mattered at the end of it all, was for myself. I needed to forgive myself for all the years I confused enabling with love, for thinking that writing a check was the same as offering real support. I needed to forgive myself for not seeing the depth of the problem sooner, for choosing the easier path of denial for far too long. And maybe most of all, I needed to forgive myself for the stubborn, foolish innocence of a father, a man who is built to believe in the best version of his child long after the evidence has proven him wrong. That was the forgiveness I fought for, and it's a forgiveness I've finally started to find. My life is very different now. It's quieter, more deliberate. I spend more time in my workshop, losing myself for hours in the smell of sawdust and the simple, honest work of making things with my hands. I've started volunteering with the local elder support group that I contacted all those months ago, sharing my story anonymously, hoping it might help someone else feel a little less alone. I still keep in touch with Violet. We have lunch together every few weeks. She's back in college, finishing the degree she started years ago, building a new future for herself, one step at a time. We are, both of us, survivors, and we are moving forward. If you're listening to this story today, and you hear an echo of your own life in my words, there is something I want you to know, from the bottom of my heart. You are not alone. Loving someone, whether it's a child, a spouse, or a friend, does not mean you have to accept their destruction. Setting a boundary is not a selfish act. It is an act of self-respect. And asking for help when you are in a dark and frightening place is not a sign of weakness. It is the single bravest and strongest thing a person can do. The family photograph is still there on my mantelpiece, in its new, sturdy oak frame. I look at it every day. The sight of it no longer brings that sharp, familiar pang of pain. It's a reminder now, a reminder of everything that happened, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the broken. It reminds me that even after we have been shattered, we can be mended. We might never be exactly the same as we were before, but we can become stronger in the broken places. I know that sometimes when we men who've lived more than half a century get together, the stories just start to flow. Today, I wanted to open my heart a little, and I truly hope I can hear some of your stories too. You know, a simple like, a subscribe, or a share, to many people, it might seem like a small passing gesture. But to me, and to other quiet voices who need to be heard, every single one of those clicks is a small light in the darkness. It's a way of saying, I see you, I hear you, your story has value. Now that I've told my story, the thing I want most is to listen to yours. In the comments below, I would be truly honored if you would share a piece of your own story. When was a time you felt disrespected or that your voice wasn't being heard? What passion or hobby of yours was once dismissed by others as being silly or a waste of time? Or what was a moment, big or small, when you found your own quiet strength? Please share your stories. I will read them, and I will carry them with me because your stories matter. WAWA Ages wants to build a community where we men, fathers, grandfathers, husbands, and friends, can share our real experiences, the good and the bad. And if you don't have a heavy story to tell today, maybe just share a small joy. What made you smile today? If you're watching this on a television, please don't hesitate to pick up your phone and look up my channel, WAWA Ages. Let's build this place together, a community where no man has to feel that his life, his struggles, and his victories are invisible. Thank you. Thank you for sitting here with me today. It means the world.